A man bought the core of a queen at the market. Unaware it would bring her back to life, Darren had never been one to believe in ancient myths or mystical objects. But when he found the glowing artifact at the market, something about it drew him in. It was unlike anything he had ever seen before. It was a core, an object that pulsated with a strange energy. The trader who sold it to him was a peculiar old man, his face hidden beneath a heavy cloak. His eyes glinted with something other than the typical market desperation. He spoke in a slow, almost hypnotic tone, claiming that the core was from an ancient civilization, one long lost to history. Darren wasn't sure what it was about the core that made him feel so compelled to buy it. Maybe it was the smooth texture of the object, the way it glowed softly in the dim light of the market. Or maybe it was the trader's insistence that it was worth more than its price, though Darren had no idea how much it was actually worth. Either way, Darren had been traveling the galaxy for years, collecting oddities for his small shop back home, and this artifact felt like it would fit perfectly in his collection. The transaction was quick. The trader handed the core to Darren without much ceremony, and Darren handed over the money. As he walked away, the object's weight in his hand seemed to grow heavier with each step. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, that the core was somehow aware of him, or perhaps that he was aware of it. Back at his small quarters, Darren placed the core on his desk. It was strange how it seemed to hum softly, as if it were alive. He tried to shake off the unsettling feeling that crept over him, attributing it to the exhaustion of his travels. The core was a beautiful piece, no doubt, but it was just another trinket. Yet as night fell and the sounds of the bustling city outside grew quieter, Darren couldn't help but feel a strange pull toward it. He sat on his bed, staring at the object. It seemed to glow even brighter in the darkness of his room. Then slowly, as though drawn by an invisible force, he reached out and touched the core. The instant his fingers brushed against it, a surge of energy shot through him. He pulled his hand back in shock, his heart pounding in his chest. The glow of the core dimmed for a moment before slowly returning to its previous brightness. Darren shook his head. "Just tired," he muttered to himself, trying to rationalize the experience, but sleep wouldn't come easily. He lay in bed, his eyes wide open, staring at the object across the room. The strange sensation lingered in the air like an unspoken whisper. That night, as he finally drifted into a restless sleep, Darren found himself standing in a vast, unfamiliar place. The air was thick with an ancient, heavy presence. He looked around, seeing a great throne room, its walls covered in strange symbols and intricate carvings. At the far end of the room sat a throne made of dark stone, and on it was a woman. She was unlike anyone Darren had ever seen. Her skin was a soft shade of violet, her hair silver and flowing like a river of light. Her eyes, glowing with a deep intensity, locked onto his as though she had been waiting for him. "Who are you?" Darren whispered, though he had no idea why he asked. The words just seemed to escape his mouth. The woman smiled, her lips curling slightly, but there was sadness in her eyes. "I am she who was forgotten," she replied, her voice echoing in the vast room. "But I am awake now, and you are the one who will bring me back." Darren took a step back, feeling a chill run down his spine. The woman's eyes held him in place, her gaze both comforting and terrifying at once. "What do you want from me?" he asked, his voice shaky. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she reached out, her fingers barely grazing the air before the room around them seemed to shift, the throne room becoming a blur of images, of stars, galaxies, and alien worlds. The woman's voice continued to speak, though it was no longer directed at him. "I was once a queen," she said, her voice filled with a sorrow that seemed to reverberate in the very air. "I ruled over an empire that stretched across the stars, but it was taken from me. Betrayed by those I trusted, my kingdom fell and I was lost, my essence scattered, my soul trapped." Darren felt a strange connection to her words, as though the room itself was trying to tell him something. It was as if the very air was filled with her memories, and he could feel the weight of her loss. Yet, despite the sadness that filled the air, there was also something more, a sense of power, of untold strength waiting to be unleashed. "You, Darren," she continued, her voice clear once more, "have found the core. You have brought me back." The room around Darren blurred again, the images of the stars and galaxies becoming more intense, swirling faster. The queen's form began to fade, her face growing more distant. "Do not forget me," she whispered, her voice growing faint. You are my last hope. Find the rest of me and I will return, but be warned. The price will be high. Darren woke with a start, sitting up in his bed, drenched in sweat. His heart raced, his mind still reeling from the dream. The room was quiet, save for the soft hum of the core on his desk, which now seemed to pulse with a steady rhythm. He stood slowly, his legs shaky, and approached the core. It was glowing brighter than before, and Darren felt an undeniable pull toward it. He reached out, his fingers trembling as they hovered above the object. The same surge of energy hit him, but this time he didn't pull away. Instead, he closed his eyes and let the sensation wash over him. Images flashed in his mind, visions of distant planets, alien cities, and a powerful empire that once was. He saw the queen again, her eyes filled with a mixture of power and sadness. He heard her voice in his head, though she wasn't speaking directly to him. It was as though her essence, her consciousness, was seeping into him, awakening something deep within him. Darren stepped back, his mind racing. He knew now that the queen wasn't just a dream. She was real, and somehow he had brought her back to life. But at what cost? The air in the room seemed heavier now, as though the walls themselves were closing in around him. Darren's fingers brushed against the core again, and he could feel the power in it, the life that it held. It was more than just an object, it was a key to something far bigger than he had ever imagined. But what did she mean by "the price will be high"? What would he have to sacrifice to bring her fully back into the world? Darren didn't know, but he felt a deep sense of inevitability. There was no turning back now. He had awakened the queen, and now her journey was his. Darren woke the next morning with a sense of unease. The strange dream from the night before lingered in his mind, vivid and unsettling. He couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed within him, something that tied him to the core and to the queen. The glowing artifact sat on his desk, just as it had the night before, but now it seemed even more alive, pulsing softly as though it were breathing. He had never been one to believe in the supernatural. His life had always been about logic, facts, and science. But the events of the past 24 hours had shattered that worldview. The core, the dreams, the voice of the queen, all of it was real. And now, Darren was caught in something far bigger than he could have imagined. He couldn't stop thinking about what the queen had said to him. "You are my last hope. Find the rest of me and I will return." What did she mean by that? What else was he supposed to find? And most importantly, why had she chosen him? Darren tried to push those thoughts aside as he went about his morning routine. He made himself a quick breakfast, though he hardly tasted the food. His mind kept drifting back to the dream, to the haunting images of the queen and her lost empire. What was it that had been taken from her? What had happened to her kingdom? He couldn't get the image of the queen's face out of his mind. Her eyes, glowing with power and sorrow, seemed to follow him wherever he went. The strange pull he felt toward the core was stronger now, like an invisible thread connecting him to something ancient and powerful. He tried to ignore it, but it was impossible. He had to know more. After finishing his breakfast, Darren sat down at his desk and stared at the core. Its soft glow seemed to beckon him, urging him to come closer. He reached out again, his hand trembling slightly. As his fingers brushed the surface of the core, the familiar surge of energy hit him. This time, however, it was different. This time, it felt as though something shifted inside him, like a door had been unlocked in his mind. Images flooded his vision, images of a grand palace, a vast city of towering spires and shining streets, and an army of soldiers marching in formation. The queen stood at the center of it all, her posture regal and commanding. She was no mere ruler, she was a force of nature, her power radiating out like a storm. Then the images shifted, becoming darker. The palace crumbled and the soldiers fell. Betrayal, destruction. Her empire was falling apart piece by piece. The queen's face, once full of pride and strength, was now filled with sorrow and rage. Her eyes burned with the weight of her losses. Darren pulled his hand away from the core, gasping for breath. The images were gone, but the feeling of them lingered, like a dark cloud hanging over him. He felt a deep sadness, as though he had witnessed something he wasn't meant to see. He wanted to forget what he had just experienced, but the memory of the queen's fall was etched into his mind. But why was the core showing him these visions? What was the connection between him and the queen? Was it just a coincidence that he had found the core, or had something greater brought him to it? Darren stood up and paced the room, his mind racing. He needed answers. He couldn't ignore this any longer. He had to find out more about the Queen and her lost empire. But where could he start? There was no one left to ask about the Queen's past, at least not in the way he needed. The Queen's empire was ancient, long gone, forgotten by most. Her people, her kingdom, gone, but Darren was determined. He needed to know more, and he was willing to do whatever it took to find the answers. He turned back to the core, his hand hovering above it once more. This time, instead of just touching it, he pressed his palm firmly against its surface. The energy surged through him again, stronger this time, as if the core was reacting to his determination. The room around him began to warp. The walls seemed to ripple like water, and the air grew thick with static. Darren's heart pounded in his chest as the world around him shifted, becoming a swirling vortex of light and color. Then, in an instant, everything went dark. When the darkness cleared, Darren found himself standing in a new place. It was the same throne room from his dream, the one he had seen in the Queen's vision. The walls were adorned with symbols, intricate and ancient. The throne at the far end of the room was made of dark stone, and sitting upon it was the Queen herself. But this time she was not just a vision. She was real, her form solid and powerful. She looked down at Darren with eyes that seemed to pierce through him, and for a moment he couldn't move. Her presence was overwhelming, like standing before a force of nature. "You came," she said, her voice echoing in the vast space. It was both a statement and a question, as though she had been waiting for him to arrive. "I knew you would." Darren swallowed hard, his mouth dry. What is this place?" "This is the heart of my empire," the Queen replied, her voice calm but filled with authority. "Before it fell, this throne room was the center of all that I ruled. Everything I built, everything I lost, is here." Darren's eyes wandered around the room, taking in the intricate carvings and the faint traces of power that still lingered in the air. It was as if the room itself held the memories of an entire civilization, a civilization that had long since faded into history. "Why am I here?" Darren asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Why did you choose me?" The Queen's eyes softened, and for a moment she looked almost human. "You did not choose this, Darren. It was the core that chose you. It has always chosen those who are worthy." Darren frowned. "Worthy? I don't understand." "The core is more than just a physical object," the Queen explained. "It is a vessel, a fragment of my soul. It holds the essence of who I was, and it seeks those who can help me reclaim what I have lost." Darren stepped closer, his mind racing. "Reclaim what? Your empire?" The Queen's gaze grew distant. "Yes, my empire, but also something far greater. The core is a key, Darren, a key to a power beyond imagination. It was created to preserve my essence, to bring me back in the event of my downfall. But now it is more than just a means of resurrection. It is the key to everything." Darren's heart skipped a beat. "What do you want from me?" The Queen's gaze turned cold, her eyes narrowing. "I want you to help me find the rest of what was taken, the rest of my power. Only then can I truly return and reclaim my throne." Darren felt a chill run down his spine. He had no idea what he was getting himself into, but he couldn't deny the pull he felt toward the Queen. There was something powerful, something almost irresistible about her. He wasn't sure if he could trust her, but he knew that his life was no longer his own. The Queen's fate was now tied to his. "I'll help you," Darren said, though his voice was uncertain. "But I don't know how." The Queen's eyes softened again, and she smiled. "You will find a way, you always do. But remember, Darren, the price will be high. You will not escape this unchanged." Darren nodded, though he had no idea what the Queen meant. All he knew was that he was caught in something far bigger than himself, and there was no turning back now. With a final, lingering glance, the Queen's form began to fade, and Darren was left alone in the throne room once more. The power in the air was gone, but the weight of her words remained. As he stood there, surrounded by the remnants of an ancient empire, Darren realized that his journey had only just begun. And the choices he made from here on out would determine not only his fate, but the fate of an entire galaxy. Darren stood still for a moment, staring at the empty throne room. The Queen had vanished, leaving only a lingering sense of power in the air. Her words echoed in his mind, and the weight of them pressed down on his chest. "The price will be high. You will not escape this unchanged." He didn't fully understand what she meant, but he could feel that something inside him had shifted. He wasn't the same man he had been just days ago. The core, the Queen, everything was changing him in ways he couldn't yet comprehend. Darren's eyes darted around the room, taking in the ancient symbols carved into the walls. It was a place that had witnessed the rise and fall of an empire, and now it was a place where he stood, connected to something far bigger than himself. The air felt thick with the past, the weight of forgotten history hanging in the silence. He had to find answers. He had to understand more about the Queen's empire and what was taken from her. Darren had no idea where to start. His mind raced with questions. What had happened to the Queen's empire? Who had betrayed her? And most importantly, what did she mean by reclaiming her power? It was clear that the core wasn't just an artifact. It was a key, a powerful piece of something much larger. But what exactly? He couldn't stay in this place forever. He needed to leave to search for answers. But before he could even think about his next step, the core, which had been silent since the vision, began to glow again. The soft, pulsing light filled the room, and Darren felt an undeniable pull toward it. Without thinking, he reached out and touched it once more. This time, the surge of energy was far stronger. His vision blurred, and he felt himself being pulled into a whirlwind of light and color. The walls of the room seemed to fade away, and Darren was plunged into darkness once again. The sense of weightlessness grew, and he felt as though he were floating in an endless void. The Queen's presence was all around him, but he couldn't see her. He could only feel her. "Darren!" The voice of the Queen echoed through the void, calm yet filled with a strange urgency. "It is time to remember." Suddenly, images flashed before him, bright and vivid. He saw a planet once thriving with life, now covered in ruins. Buildings that had once reached for the sky were now crumbling to dust. The streets were empty, save for the occasional shadow moving through the debris. He could feel the Queen's sorrow as the images shifted, showing the battle that had brought about the fall of her empire. Armies clashed in the distance, and the air was thick with the sound of destruction. Darren felt the Queen's emotions as if they were his own, the pain, the rage, the betrayal. It was overwhelming. He saw her standing in the middle of the battlefield, her face filled with determination, but also with sadness. Her army had been defeated, and her people were scattered to the wind. The rival faction that had betrayed her had won, and her empire had been reduced to nothing. As the images faded, Darren found himself standing on the surface of a different world. The landscape was barren, with only the remnants of the Queen's once great palace standing in the distance. The ruins were all that remained of her civilization. The core pulsed in Darren's hand, and he felt a connection to the place, as if it were calling him to find something. He took a step forward, his feet crunching on the dry, cracked ground. The air felt cold and empty, as though the life that had once existed here had been drained away. It was a haunting sight, and Darren couldn't help but feel a sense of loss for a world that no longer existed. He knew that the Queen's past was tied to this place, but what was he supposed to do here? What was he meant to find? A figure appeared in the distance, a shadow against the ruins. Darren squinted, trying to make out who it was. As the figure drew closer, Darren recognized her, another version of the Queen, but this one was different. She was younger, filled with hope, and standing tall as though she were still the ruler of her empire. The sadness that had filled her presence before was absent. This was the Queen before everything had gone wrong. The Queen's eyes locked onto Darren's, and she smiled. "You've come," she said softly, her voice filled with warmth. "I knew you would." Darren took a step forward, his heart pounding. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice trembling. "What is this place?" "This is the beginning," the Queen replied. "Before the empire fell, before the betrayal, this was where I stood, proud and strong, ready to lead my people to greatness." Darren looked around at the ruins of the palace. It was hard to imagine that such a place had once been filled with life and power. "But where is everyone? What happened to your empire?" The Queen's expression darkened, and she stepped closer to Darren. "The empire was destroyed by those I trusted," she said. "They turned against me, and everything I had built crumbled. My people were scattered, and my legacy was erased from history." Darren could feel the weight of her words. The pain in her voice was real, and it echoed in his own heart. He understood now what she had meant by the price being high. Her empire had been everything to her, and its destruction had cost her more than just her throne. It had cost her everything. "But why me?" Darren asked, his voice filled with confusion. "Why did the core choose me? I'm just a man. I don't understand." The Queen's eyes softened, and she placed a hand on his shoulder. "You are not just any man, Darren. You were chosen because you are capable of restoring what was lost." The core has a bond with you, one that can bring me back, but there is still much to do. Darren's mind was spinning. What do you need from me? What do I have to do? The queen stepped back, her eyes narrowing as though she were searching for something. I need you to help me reclaim my power, she said. The core is only the beginning. There are other fragments scattered across the galaxy, pieces of my essence that were lost when my empire fell. Find them, and we can rebuild everything. Darren stared at her, his heart heavy with the responsibility that was now resting on his shoulders. He had no idea what he was getting into, but he knew one thing. His life was no longer his own. He had been drawn into something far bigger than himself, something that could change the fate of entire worlds. The queen's form began to fade, and the landscape around Darren shifted once more. He found himself back in his quarters, standing in front of the core. The pulsing light seemed to have faded, but the sense of power was still there, lingering in the air. Darren stood in silence, his mind racing with everything he had seen. The queen's empire, her fall, and the fragments of her power scattered across the galaxy. It was too much to process all at once. But one thing was clear, he had a choice to make. He could turn away, forget everything, and go back to his old life. Or he could take the queen's offer and help her rebuild her empire to restore what had been lost. But Darren knew there was no going back now. The core had chosen him, and the queen had awakened within him. He couldn't ignore the call. He had to find the fragments, and he had to help her reclaim what was rightfully hers. The weight of the decision pressed down on him, but Darren steeled himself. He didn't know what lay ahead, but he was ready to face whatever came next. The queen's journey was his now, and together they would seek out the lost fragments and rebuild her empire. But as Darren stared at the core, one thought echoed in his mind: the price will be high. He didn't know what that price would be, but he was beginning to realize that it might cost him more than he was willing to give. Darren sat at his desk, staring at the core. The light from the artifact had dimmed, but its presence still hung heavily in the air, a constant reminder of the queen and the responsibility he had accepted. He hadn't expected his life to turn upside down when he purchased that strange object from the market, but now he was bound to something far greater than himself. The queen's empire, her power, her lost legacy, it was all in his hands now. He had a task to complete, though the weight of it pressed heavily on his chest. The queen had spoken of fragments, pieces of her power scattered across the galaxy. He didn't know where to begin, where to look for these lost fragments, or how to even start this monumental task. But he knew one thing: he couldn't run away from it. The queen's presence, her voice, her memories, everything connected to the core was inside him now. There was no turning back. Darren took a deep breath and stood up, pushing away from his desk. He couldn't sit here forever, lost in thought. He needed to act. The galaxy was vast, and he was just one man, but the queen had chosen him. He had to find the other fragments of her power, no matter how dangerous the journey might be. The first step, he realized, was to learn as much as he could about the queen's empire, her past, and the people who had betrayed her. He needed information, old records, forgotten stories, anything that could guide him on this path. He left his quarters and made his way through the city. The streets were bustling with activity, the noise of the market, the chatter of people, and the hum of distant machines filling the air. It felt like any other day, but to Darren, everything felt different now. He was carrying the weight of an ancient empire on his shoulders, and he had no idea how to make sense of it all. His first stop was a library, a dusty old place on the edge of the city. It was filled with ancient books and records, long forgotten by most of the population. The librarian, an elderly woman with a sharp gaze, eyed him as he entered. "I need information about a lost empire," Darren said, his voice steady but with an undercurrent of uncertainty. "A powerful empire, one that fell a long time ago." The librarian raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. Instead, she led him to a row of old books, their covers worn and pages yellowed with age. "These might have what you seek," she said, "but be warned, some stories are better left untold." Darren nodded, though he didn't fully understand her warning. He wasn't afraid of the unknown. He had already crossed into uncharted territory when he touched the core. Nothing could scare him now. He spent the next few hours going through the books, scanning page after page of ancient history, learning about the Queen's empire. It had been vast, spanning entire star systems, with a mighty army and a people who worshipped their ruler. The Queen was not just a monarch, she was a symbol of strength and unity. Her empire was built on the idea of peace and prosperity for all, but that peace had been shattered by betrayal. The more Darren read, the more he understood the depth of the Queen's loss. Her empire had been torn apart from within, and the ones she trusted had been the ones to destroy everything. The rival faction that had betrayed her was still out there, and they were the key to finding the fragments. But they were also a threat, a dangerous one. If they knew the Queen was alive, if they knew she had returned, they would stop at nothing to destroy her once again. Darren felt a chill run down his spine as he closed the last book. The history he had just read was full of violence, betrayal, and sorrow. It made him question whether he was truly ready for the journey ahead. The Queen had chosen him, but did he have the strength to follow through? Could he live up to the expectations of someone as powerful as her? He didn't have answers, but he did have a purpose. The core pulsed in his bag, as if reminding him that there was no turning back. He had to find the fragments, and he had to face whatever dangers lay ahead. The next few days were spent preparing. Darren gathered supplies, food, water, equipment, and made plans for his first journey. He knew the search wouldn't be easy. The galaxy was vast, and the fragments could be hidden in the most dangerous and remote corners of space. But he couldn't afford to hesitate. The Queen had entrusted him with her future, and he couldn't let her down. As he sat in his small room, packing the last of his belongings, the core began to glow again. Darren paused, feeling the familiar pull. This time he wasn't surprised. The Queen's presence was with him, guiding him even though he couldn't see her. Her power was inside the core, and it was slowly growing stronger. He could feel it in the air around him, an energy that was both comforting and overwhelming. "You are ready," the Queen's voice echoed in his mind. Darren stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. "Ready for what?" "To find the fragments," she replied. "The pieces of me that were scattered across the stars, you know where to start." Darren closed his eyes, taking a deep breath. The Queen's words filled his mind, and he knew she was right. He did know where to start. The first fragment wasn't far from here. It was located on a remote planet, a world once part of her empire, now abandoned and forgotten. He had to go there. It was the first step on his journey, and it was one he couldn't delay any longer. The next morning, Darren boarded a ship and set off toward the distant planet. The journey was long, but the core kept pulsing, a constant reminder of the mission he had undertaken. The ship's engines hummed steadily, but Darren couldn't relax. He kept thinking about the dangers he would face, the people who would try to stop him, and the power that the Queen was asking him to find. As the planet came into view, Darren's heart raced. The world was barren, covered in dust and ruins. The once great cities were now crumbling, forgotten by time. There was no sign of life, no signs of the empire that had once flourished here. The ship landed softly on the surface, and Darren stepped out, his boots crunching on the dry ground. The wind whipped through the ruins, carrying with it the scent of decay. He had arrived at the heart of a lost empire. The first fragment the Queen had told him was hidden here. But where? The planet was vast, and the ruins stretched for miles. Darren could feel the pull of the core growing stronger, urging him to move forward. He didn't know where to look, but he trusted the Queen. She had led him this far, and he had to believe that she would guide him to the next piece. Hours passed as Darren searched the ruins, exploring every building and every cave he could find. There was no sign of the fragment, but as the sun began to set, something caught his eye. A small opening in the side of a crumbled wall, hidden beneath a layer of dirt and debris. He crawled toward it, his heart pounding. He could feel the core's energy growing stronger, as if it were leading him here. Inside the hidden chamber, Darren found what he had been searching for, a small pedestal, and on it, a glowing object. It was a fragment of the Queen's power, just as she had described. He reached out and took it, feeling a surge of energy flood through him. The fragment was warm to the touch, and as soon as his fingers made contact, the Queen's presence filled his mind. "You have found it," her voice said, filled with pride. "One piece of me is now restored." Darren felt a sense of accomplishment, but the journey was far from over. There were more fragments to find, more pieces of the Queen's lost empire to reclaim. The path ahead was still uncertain, but Darren knew one thing for sure. He was no longer just a man. He was part of something much larger. And with the Queen's guidance, he would restore her empire piece by piece. Darren held the fragment in his hand, feeling its warmth spread through his fingers. It wasn't just an object. It was a part of the Queen, a piece of her lost power. As soon as he touched it, her presence filled his mind again, and the familiar voice echoed in his thoughts. "You have done well, Darin," the queen's voice said, calm and full of approval. "But this is only the beginning. Many more pieces remain. You must find them all if we are to restore what was lost." Darin stood in the ruins of the planet, the weight of the queen's words pressing heavily on his chest. He knew the journey ahead would be long and difficult, but he had made a promise. He had taken the queen's burden upon himself, and there was no turning back now. He could feel the connection between them growing stronger with each fragment he found. The energy of the queen's power, once scattered and broken, was slowly being restored. But Darin couldn't help but wonder how much longer he could keep going. Every step brought him closer to something that felt like destiny, but it also brought him further from the life he had known. His journey had already taken him to distant worlds, and now he was following a path he never could have imagined. The planet he stood on, once part of the Queen's vast empire, was nothing more than a shadow of its former self. The cities that had once thrived with life were now nothing but crumbled buildings, overtaken by nature and the passage of time. There was no sign of the people who had once lived here, no remnants of the great civilization the Queen had ruled. Only dust and silence. Darin took a deep breath and turned toward the horizon. He had to leave this place and continue his search. There were more fragments, and he couldn't waste time. The Queen's voice guided him, but there were still so many unknowns who had destroyed her empire. And what had happened to the people who had once served her? As he boarded his ship and prepared for takeoff, Darin couldn't shake the feeling that the answers to these questions were waiting for him, just out of reach. As he flew through the vast emptiness of space, Darin reflected on how much had changed since he first touched the core. He had gone from a simple traveler to someone who held the fate of an entire empire in his hands. The Queen's power had slowly begun to awaken within him, and with it, a sense of responsibility that he could not ignore. He wasn't sure where to go next. The fragments were scattered across the galaxy, each one hidden on a different planet. But he knew the Queen's power would guide him. The core had led him to this first fragment, and now it was up to him to follow where it would lead next. Days passed as Darin navigated the vast expanse of space. He stopped on several planets, each one holding clues to the Queen's past. Some were inhabited, their people offering bits of information that helped him piece together the history of the Queen's empire. Others were abandoned, their ruins offering little more than a sense of emptiness. One day, after weeks of traveling, Darin arrived at a remote planet that seemed to be the perfect place to search for the next fragment. The planet was known for its ancient ruins, remnants of a civilization that had existed long before the Queen's empire. According to the records he had found, this planet had once been part of her domain, but it had been abandoned long before her downfall. Darin landed his ship near a cluster of ruins, the crumbled walls and broken stone structures standing as silent witnesses to a forgotten past. He stepped out of his ship, the familiar weight of the core in his bag, and began his search. The ruins were vast, stretching out in all directions, and Darin knew it would take time to explore every inch of them. But he wasn't in a hurry. He had all the time in the world, and he wasn't going to leave until he found the next piece. As he wandered through the ruins, Darin began to feel a strange sense of connection to the place. It was as if the planet itself was alive, holding memories of the past in its very soil. The air felt heavy with history, and Darin could almost hear whispers on the wind, whispers that seemed to beckon him deeper into the ruins. Hours passed as he explored, but the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the landscape. He was about to turn back when something caught his eye. A small alcove, hidden beneath a collapsed archway, was partially covered by vines and debris. There was something about it, something that felt different from the other parts of the ruins. Darin moved toward the alcove, carefully pushing aside the vines and debris. He crouched down and saw a pedestal half buried in the dirt. His heart skipped a beat. He had found it, the second fragment. The pedestal was made of stone, but the object resting on it was unlike anything Darin had ever seen. It was a small, intricately carved gem, glowing with a soft, otherworldly light. Darin reached out and picked it up, feeling the familiar surge of energy fill his body. The Queen's power flowed into him once again, and her voice echoed in his mind. "You have found it," she said, her voice filled with pride. "Another piece of me is now restored." Darin felt the warmth of the fragment in his hand, and he couldn't help but feel a sense of accomplishment. He had found another piece of the Queen's power, and he was one step closer to fulfilling his promise. But even as the sense of victory washed over him, Darren knew that the journey was far from over. The second fragment was important, but it was only a small piece of the puzzle. There were more fragments to find, and each one would bring him closer to the Queen's ultimate goal, to restore her empire and take back what had been lost. But the road ahead was uncertain. There were still dangers to face, enemies to confront, and questions to answer. As he turned to leave the alcove, Darren felt a strange sense of urgency. The Queen's presence was growing stronger within him, but so was the sense of responsibility. He wasn't just finding fragments, he was building something. He was part of the Queen's journey, and in a way, her future depended on him. Darren stepped out of the ruins, the second fragment securely tucked into his bag. The sun had set, and the stars were beginning to shine brightly in the sky above. He felt a renewed sense of purpose, but he also felt the weight of the journey ahead. There were still many fragments to find, and he didn't know how long it would take or what challenges he would face. But he was ready. As he made his way back to the ship, Darren knew that he couldn't stop now. The Queen's empire, her legacy, it was all within reach. The fragments were coming together, and Darren was determined to see it through. He had made a promise, and he intended to keep it. The road ahead would be difficult, but Darren knew one thing for sure. He wasn't alone. The Queen was with him, guiding him, and together they would restore what had been lost.